All right, the Lord be with you. Well, you guys are awake this morning. Well, let's open with a word of prayer. Well, good, most gracious God, once again we come before you and give you all thanks and praise for this day and for this opportunity to be able to gather in your word. So, Lord, as we gather here today, Lord, we recognize, the impact that the Holy Spirit has had on the church that we have been studying here in Acts, and pray, Lord, that as your Spirit continues to be a strength behind the church and the direction of the church, that you continue to pour out your blessings upon us here at Ascension. And Lord, bless our time that we have here to get together as we really are closing out our study of Acts. Lord, may it continue not just to enhance our knowledge of you and who you are, but Lord, to enhance the faith that we have in you as well, to live that faith out in our everyday life. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, this has been somewhat of an interesting week. I was talking to some of you earlier. A lot of storms across the U.S. You're kind of concerned for our daughter in Lincoln. You're watching the news, watching the big tornado there. That was about 4 miles from her house, 5 miles from her house, and so she was hanging out in the basement with our grand animals, her dog and her cat, but she was fine. But she says, I've always joked about these storms come through. Normally what happens when the tornadoes come, they come south. And so it's something that she's only had to see from a distance. She's never seen one up close. Now she has. It's got a whole different meaning to her now, okay? And so I thought, well, here's the question. Have you ever found yourself caught in a storm and really concerned for your safety? You ever been in one? Anybody ever been in one? Yeah. I can remember one time we went on vacation to Moab. Anybody ever been to Moab? Okay. Well, we went mountain biking. And we went up there into the mountains, unloaded our bikes. Now, coming from Colorado, we would watch storms come in and we'd say, okay, here comes a storm. We know we got about this much time. All right? So we got out and we went biking and we got about 10 minutes out, and that storm we thought was about 2 hours away was almost right on top of us. And, so fearing for protection of the kids and everything, we had to get back to my truck, okay? And so we weren't going to hide underneath trees. We heard that wasn't good, right? And so we got back just really in time as the storm hit. But we were really concerned for the safety of the kids, our safety, and then we were concerned we were not going to be able to get out. Even though we had four-wheel drive and whatnot, it was just a big old mud pit. So we got in line at the You Wash It place where you spray it off. You notice I said got in line with everybody else who was trying to get all the mud and everything off of their vehicles. So it was a pretty scary time. Kind of makes you reevaluate things, doesn't it, when you get caught in a storm like that. Well, as we move into, because nobody else wants to share, right? And I look at you guys and it's like,
Well, I saw the worst of humanity.
You did? Okay, where was that?
In Lansing, Michigan. This Colorado girl had never been in anything like a tornado before. And there was a warning, and I happened to be pregnant, but I had a 3-year-old little girl. And I was in the shower, got a knock on the door, come on, we have to evacuate to a storm shelter. And there I am, and men are just plowing over, they're running, they're not helping, they're not saying, can we help you? They would have trampled anybody to pieces to get, and I was invisible.
It's amazing what happens when fear takes over, isn't it? Kind of changes, I think, a lot of people. Yeah. Well, as we're getting into Acts chapter 27, Acts chapter 27 is actually a really, really short chapter. But in it, we probably get the best descriptions of, I don't know how you do it, nautical and meteorological matters, and as much as they would have known here in the first century. And so I think one of the things we'll realize as we go through this chapter, who the author is. We'll be able to recognize as we go through this chapter that Luke is the writer, and that Luke is an eyewitness, and that Luke is accompanying Paul to Rome. And so this chapter also will show us how Paul's faith is put to a very practical test. What would happen if Paul was tested with a life-threatening storm? Would the rampaging nature would that impact his faith when the storm rages on? That, as PJ was talking about, there's nobody to intervene, right? As the storm rages on, there's nobody to intervene to save his life. And of course, we know if he were to appeal, even appeal to the emperor, there's nobody that could help him at this time, right? So this storm was worse than, I think, as you think of it in terms of storms on the Sea of Galilee, this is probably about as bad as it gets. Okay? And this time, Jesus isn't in the boat to calm the storm. Okay? That the storm is going to rage on, and that's going to be that. But then, as I read the chapter, the thought crossed my mind, okay, Jesus not in the boat to calm the storm, but I wonder, was Jesus present anyway? All right? So we're going to go ahead and start. So I want to start by reading the first 12 verses, the first section where it talks about Paul sails for Rome. So I get a volunteer to read that. First hand that goes up gets it. Okay, your hand.
And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was
Say it with authority.
which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica.
There you go.
The next day we put in that sided. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. Then the centurion found the ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty just off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea, and from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there.
Thank you. Now I know nobody stepped forward to read it. That's what a lot of people do. They look at the words and go, no, I'm not going there. So thank you, Ruth Ann. Very gallant effort there. And so we see what happens here as we begin. Paul is setting sail for Rome. The trip begins. Now, from what we're told, how does it start? It says, and when it was decided that who should sail for Italy? We, indicating that he was with Paul at this time, as was Aristarchus, now they were with him in Macedonia and had been with him back in Ephesus, right? So Aristarchus, like Luke, had accompanied Paul to Jerusalem with the relief offering. Remember that? Okay. He was the one who, with Gaius, were rushed into the theater in Ephesus by that raging mob, and they would be with Paul in Rome, and they either stayed with Paul or stayed nearby. Okay, stayed nearby for 2 years. And so we find as we read this, they were on a commercial vessel. So this would have been one that hauled freight. Now, usually it was only the military vessels that were allowed in Caesarea. But we find here, as we get this, they're on a boat that's going to be hauling, or vessel, I guess I should say. I don't know, is it a boat or a ship? I know that's what you get in trouble with when you're on a cruise. You call it a boat or a ship, okay? You get in trouble, all right? But at any rate, we encounter this centurion by the name of Julius, okay? Now, not much is known about Julius, most of which we really get just right here. It appears as though he is pretty friendly and he trusts Paul. He even allows Paul to be free and visit with friends. Now, usually when we read about these centurions in the New Testament, they are usually reflected in a positive light. And Julius here belongs to this special imperial regiment. So a regiment at that time, I'm trying to think.
Was it a portion of the legion?
I'm trying to remember how many soldiers. And I'm trying to think that there were probably like 100. Does that sound right?
Centurions had 100.
Okay, so 100. All right. So Julius, though, was part of a regiment that served more so as a courier or an escort rather than anything else. And so here we see what he's doing is he's escorting prisoners. All right? And we see the ship moves along the coast, and what was called, if you lived in the eastern part of the country, they always get concerned when they have these nor'easters that come up. Pretty dangerous storms. Well, in this area, they had what they called coasters. All right? And so what happened when they were having a coaster was the ships really tried to stay closer to shore. And when you think of the ships that actually ventured out into the deep water, I guess is a long way to put it, that were built for these long voyages, there were only a few that were really out there that could handle that. And so we find there in verse 6, it's an Alexandrian ship, right? It's an Alexandrian ship, and it's primarily used to transport grain, but it's also big enough to transport 272 prisoners. All right, and it has that capability. It's of a good enough size that it can cross the sea. And so what we find is they're making slow headway here. The winds are apparently against them. And so you think about it this way, during the different seasons, the winds kind of come from different directions, right? They come from different directions. And so here in this area, in August and September, the prevailing winds actually come from the northwest. Okay? So the ship sailed on the leeward or downwind side of the island, heading for Cilicia. Now, we're told here the Jews stopped sailing 5 days after the fast. Okay, now the fast was what? We knew that as the Day of Atonement, right? So they stopped for a little while, okay? And, well, I don't know how long they actually, it's 5 days I think is what they stopped. So I was looking for where that actually is talked about. I found it in Leviticus 16, it's 16 verses 29 and 30. And it says, "And it shall be a statute to you forever, that in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict yourself and shall do no work, either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you." Okay? And so they stopped to make sure that they could recognize now that. And so here you're thinking of sailing, and because of the storms that they knew were coming with the winds, really trying to sail out there anytime past September 15th, I guess, middle of the month, would have been doubtful. And anything after, the beginning of November in that area, trying to sail at that time would have been considered suicidal, just because of the winds. The winds were so great at that time. So one of the things they're finding is, well, there's not many places they can stop and try to wait out the weather, the winter weather, right? And so what the centurion was deciding to do was to take a more direct route, which he hoped would get him and his prisoners to Rome much sooner. Hoped that what they would do is they would avoid a lot of the impacts of the weather. And when they were off the coast here of Cilicia and Pamphylia, their ship landed at Myra and Lycia, where a prisoner transfer to another ship could take place. Now, verse 12 tells us what? What does verse 12 tell us?
Unsuitable.
Yeah.
And the majority.
Yeah, because of the harbor was not suitable, what they were trying to do was do what? Reach Phoenix. Okay?
Not Arizona.
What's that? Yeah, not Arizona. Although I don't know if the winds would have been any better, but, right? Now, Phoenix was about another 50 to 60 miles up the coast. So they were hoping if they could get there, they could winter there. Okay, the winds would not be as bad. Okay, and so this trip that they're on is fraught with peril, right? It really, Paul is recognizing that they are in some serious trouble here, trying to do what they're doing. But it's not his ship. He's not putting the ship at risk, but he's telling those that are putting the ship at risk, you're doing that at risk of the ship, the cargo, and the lives on board. Okay? So, let's look at 13 through, 26? Okay, let's do that. 13 through 26.
Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, he gave way to it and was driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on surface, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. And since they were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay upon us, all hope of being saved was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail for Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I worship, and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all of those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have told you. But when we must run aground once in the island.
Okay. All right. So heading south now towards Crete, right? They have south wind, which means the wind blew from the south to the north. All right. And as they would set sail there, it would make it easier then to head a little more westward. However, the nor'easter came up. The nor'easter is a wind from the north. It's just, I say, you get a lot of this when you go through this, trying to figure out what direction the winds are going, for crying out loud. And so you get this wind from the north and east, and it's really described here as being somewhat hurricane force. Okay, so you think about those images you get on the news and things like that when hurricanes are going through different places. You just see how that wind is blowing, right? And winds like this would drive a ship into the Mediterranean Sea and away from Crete. And so they found themselves on the lee side or below the island of Cauda, or about 22 miles south of Crete. And so what this is telling us is they're trying to make this trip, and they are off course. All right? They are off course. And so numerous attempts are being made now to save the ship. The small lifeboat tied behind a larger vessel, what we might look at as might have been like a lifeboat, right? It's kind of let go. Because what's happening is they're trying to make way. This small boat gets swamped. It's difficult to pull in, so they can't do anything with it. It's tied to the larger boat. It's crashing against the ship. It's causing the ship to break up, the small boat to break up. And so what they do is they undergird the boat. They take that rope, and they tie it around the boat to try to keep it from breaking up, hold it together. So they're trying to ease the impact of these prevailing winds. They lower the sails, right? So they're not really being pushed by the wind anymore. And so as they lower the sails, though, what does that do to their progress? Slows it way down, right? Slows it way down. And so fearing that all is going to be lost, what do? They jettison the cargo. They start throwing things overboard. They were worried that they would run aground on Syrtis or a sandbar. So that means they're probably not too far off the coast of what we would probably recognize today as Libya. And then hang on a second, I have to check something. So verse 18 is when they were jettisoning the cargo, right? They're starting to toss everything over. They're jettisoning the cargo. They're throwing the furniture overboard. They're throwing all their gear overboard. And when they're starting to do that, trying to get rid of everything they can that may cause them a problem, what does that tell you?
All hope is lost.
Yeah, that tells me things are not looking too good here. That they are.
Once they start tossing the tackle for the sails and everything overboard,
Yeah.
you don't have any guidance at all.
You don't have any guidance at all, yeah. And so the other thing is, how did they normally navigate?
By stars.
By stars and the sun, right? And what are we told here? What's going on?
Several days without.
Cloudy.
Several days, cloudy, several days without the sun and the stars. This is a very treacherous storm that they're in. And so, yes, as they're looking at everything going all around them and the condition of their ship, you can see where they're thinking their situation is hopeless. Okay, they've gone without food for a long time. And I'm sure any of you have ever been on a ship in rough seas. I'm sure anxiety and seasickness are major contributors.
I do that on a rowboat.
You do that on a rowboat? Boy, that's really a bummer. A rowboat. Yeah, so now, I wouldn't say Paul was really trying to be in their face here. But what does he say? He basically says what?
I was right.
He says, I was right, you were wrong. I told you so. You wouldn't listen to me, right? So he reminded them of his advice. Hey, you guys really do not want to go on this trip. So his reasoning, commentators believe, was a reminder to them to believe his words of encouragement. Okay, believe his words of encouragement. Remember, Paul belonged to God, right? And God promised Paul what?
He would go to Caesar.
He would be a witness in Rome, right? Before Caesar, just as he had been there in Jerusalem. All right, so there's some good news. They could use some good news right now, don't you think? Yeah. Things are not looking too good. God was reaffirming that promise, in a time when they were in great danger and it looked as though all hope was lost. And he added something a little bit special to that promise. What did he say? He said, I am going to spare everybody. I am going to spare all the lives on board. Now, Paul had prayed for all on the ship, and God would spare them all. So Paul shares God's promise of survival through a vision that he had gotten from God. So that is what the angel meant by God is graciously giving you the lives of all that sail with you. All right? Only the ship is going to be lost. So whoever owned the ship, too bad. Hope you had good insurance. The ship is going to be lost. That's all there is to it. Here's the thing, that just jumped out at me. Ships are replaceable. Lives are not. What's important? The lives. All right? And so given the circumstance in Paul's deduction that they would run aground on some island is what was going to happen, and this was based in the fact that they were not near a mainland, and the fact that the condition of the ship was not such that it would be able to reach a mainland port. So the concern is, are we going to run aground? Are we going to break up? Or what's going to happen? What is going to happen? All right? You feel the kind of tension building here? All right. So let's read 27 through 38.
Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little farther, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day, you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from your head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. When he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged, and also took food themselves. And in all we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea.
Okay, so here comes the shipwreck. Did Paul say this was going to happen? Yeah, he did. But we hear, he says, like, when the 14th night had come, you know, they were being driven there across the Adriatic Sea, which would have been, what, to the west of Crete, right? Okay.
Yeah, but at that time, I think it would encompass more than just to the west of Italy, it would be to the south.
And to the south as well, yeah. Yeah. And so,
It's like with the word Asia, it meant something a little bit different than it does today.
yeah, so this would have encompassed all the area even south of Italy, encompassed Greece. So this is what we today would probably we'll call this area the Mediterranean. Okay, Mediterranean. Now, the sailors sensed the approach of land by smell and the sound of breakers. Okay, breakers are waves as they make shore. They make a kind of a roar kind of sound, or as they hit the rocks, they make this very distinct sounds. And so the sounds that they were hearing were confirming what their noses were telling them and what their ears were telling them. So they dropped anchor to keep from being driven ashore in the darkness. Okay, now what kind of comes out here is, yes, all appears to be lost. So some of the ship's crew, under the guise of dropping anchor in front of the ship, are planning to do what? Well, they're going to go overboard. They're going to desert everybody else. It's like one of these, we're going to go save ourselves. All right? They're going to save ourselves. So Paul warns Julius, and Julius takes action. What does Julius do?
Cuts the skiff.
He cuts the skiff away. Okay? So they're not going anywhere. Everybody is, so to speak, in the same boat, right? They're all there in the same boat. All right? So just before dawn, what does Paul urge them all to do? Eat. All right. So here you have someone who is a prisoner, who's also a man of faith, who is assuming leadership in a time of crisis. And so he took responsibility for the safety and welfare of all on board, all the while giving thanks to who? To God in the midst of the trouble they found themselves in. So after eating, now it was time to dump the precious wheat cargo that they didn't throw overboard a little bit earlier. And so again, this was done to do what? Lighten the load, right? Lighten the load. Okay. How am I doing on time? Ooh, awesome. So let's read 39 through 44. 39 through 44.
Daylight came.
Who's got it?
When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow struck fast and could not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely.
Okay. All right. So they didn't recognize the land. The ship carried, the storm carried the ship well outside the normal shipping lane. So this is an area they're in that at least the seasoned sailors would not have recognized. This would have been very actually unfamiliar to them. But now was the time to prepare for impact. The anchors were cut loose. The rudder was unsecured, leaving the ship then at the mercy of the land, of the wind and the waves. The foresail was raised to catch whatever wind they could catch and to drive them into shore. So at this point in time, everyone is on the ship, right? Everyone is on the ship. But soon, they will all be on land, won't they? They'll all be on land. And so what could happen once they reach land? What do you think? You got the crew and you got the prisoners. What can happen once they reach land? You want to verbalize that, Mike? You just went, poof. Everybody might disappear, right? The prisoners may scramble to escape, and so the soldiers are saying, well, the natural thing to do to maintain control of these prisoners is to do what? Kill them. All right? They're not going to escape then. And if any of them escape, what would happen to the soldiers? They'd be in trouble. They'd have to pay for it with their own life too. All right? So Julius makes a command decision. So, I find this kind of interesting. All this is going on. Now Julius steps forward, okay? And so he wanted to save Paul's life, didn't he? So Paul has really done good for him and for everyone else here. And so he really wanted to save his life. And so now, just bear in mind, Paul is now shipwrecked for the fourth time. Okay, for the fourth time. In 2 Corinthians 11:25 it says, 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day I was adrift at sea. So now Paul's shipwrecked for the fourth time. But all are saved, and Paul lives to preach in Rome. Now I find this interesting. It talks about, getting caught up on a reef. And I thought, well, you think seasoned sailors, they ought to know better, right? They ought to know better. If they're doing all these soundings and they get a feel for what's underneath them, they ought to be able to tell whether or not a reef is coming up. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek. When Charlene and I went to Hawaii, we met up with our cousins, who are very seasoned sailors. Matter of fact, 2 of them are master captains, and so it's like, they really know their stuff. And we went out sailing one day. And we're sailing along, and all of a sudden, we stopped like we were stopping on a dime. You know what happened? We ran into a reef. And we got stuck. And so literally, what had to happen is had to get out of the boat, drop the sails, get out of the boat, grab the anchor, try to swim with the anchor back and drop it to try to pull the boat off the reef so we could get the rudder up and everything so we could skim over and move to the side. And we were literally stuck out there for about an hour. It's like, I just looked at her cousin and says, okay, just get me back to shore. We had a nice view. If you ever watched this TV show Gilligan's Island, the scene that they show in the beginning of the island, that's the view we had. And I go, this is not a good sign. So now all are saved, and Paul now has the opportunity to move on, to go to Rome, to be able to have his audience with Caesar, to be able to preach the gospel. So now, gosh, I got so much time left. I got to figure out what I'm going to do next week then. I told you this was a short chapter, didn't I? So I have next week's done. So why don't we hand those out? We'll get started on next week. And I'll learn how to make, what do they call those hands next week, so we can do that. So we got a volunteer to help me pass these out. Do 2 here. Mike, are you going to handle some or? Okay. Once you get this side over here. Okay. So I asked you last week, I asked you the question, I says, so how do you think it ends? How do you think Acts ends? And of course, we had a variety of different thoughts. So now we're going to find out. One of the things we've seen in the book of Acts is that Paul's obedience to God has brought many blessings, hasn't it? All right? And we have seen throughout the book of Acts, this is not an uncommon occurrence. So, we know that there are many other instances that have taken place in the Bible where obedience has brought forth blessings from God. Do you need more, Mike, or you got enough?
Okay.
Okay? In Luke 11, Jesus says, blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and keep it. In James, he kind of says something similar when he says, but the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed. Okay? James is talking about the response that we have to the blessings of God. And so in Psalm 21, David, he says, but the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. So we see this time and time and time again. The blessing of being obedient to God, of being obedient to God's will, the blessing that really comes out of that, it may not seem that way at the time, right? How many of you have ever looked back on your life with that 20/20 vision and you say, you know, I don't agree with what God was doing when I was going through it, but now that I've been through it and I look at what God has done, you go, wow. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Lord, for the blessing. And so we know in the Bible there are many more instances where God blessed those who are obedient to Him. And in doing so, gave them, I guess maybe a way to put it would be the desires of their heart, that they were blessed in a way that they really felt that they were blessed. Okay? But it was now time. Paul's been under detention for many years now, right? Up to this point. He's now on his way to Rome for trial before Caesar. You know, the road or the sea, or no matter how they were taking him there, has been a pretty rough one. All right? And, you know, like we just went through in the previous chapter, all the things that he experienced there on the shipwreck. But now is the time for God to grant his servant Paul what it is he wishes the most. All right? So this week, Paul's desire to be in Rome is going to be fulfilled. And so the opening of our chapter finds him on the island of Malta. Okay? And kind of looking at the map, Malta, I guess you'd say south and west of Italy, kind of down at the end. A little island out there. Okay? So that's where we're going to find him. Now, instead of putting the prisoners to death to prevent escape, those who could swim swam. Those who couldn't floated on the driftwood. And so Luke told us that because everyone listened to Paul, now, you guys kind of know that's one of those words that really sticks out. And it says everyone. Everyone is one of those all-inclusive words. That's a very strong word. You know, when you say everyone, that means everyone. Okay? Everyone reached shore safely. Okay? So when you read the Bible, that's one of those things to kind of pay attention to, those all-inclusive words. Because I think those are real important. You know, that we just pay attention, that realizing that those all-inclusive words definitely mean all. Okay? So let's go ahead and start, and we'll just look at the first 10 verses. That's what we'll do. So let's look at the first 10 verses of chapter 28. Is everybody looking to see if there are any big names? I love it, I love it. All right,
Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood and, as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. How far?
through verse 10.
There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him and, after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed.
Okay. All right. You know, here we got snakes again. We have feral cats around the apartment, and one of these feral cats likes to sleep on one of the chairs I have on my patio. She brought me a little gift this week. Can you guess what it was?
Oh my goodness.
It is still there. I have not touched it.
Dead or alive?
It's dead. It's dead, but it's just laying there. Anyway. So, safely ashore now, they find that they were on this friendly island by the name of Malta. Okay? Now, Malta is about 60 miles south of Sicily. It's not a big island. It's about 17 miles long and about 8 miles wide. So about twice as long as it is wide. And so since the island was not very big, the sailors on Paul's ship had probably either been around or on Malta, maybe even before, and they probably recognized it. Now, the people of the island are referred to in the Greek as barbaroi, or natives. Okay, natives. Now, what this doesn't mean, okay, when you think and you hear the term native, what is it? What is the thought that comes to your mind? You hear the term native. What do you think comes to your mind?
Local.
Local.
Born and raised.
You know, so here you got these sophisticated sailors coming in, and they come across these natives. You know, they probably thought they were somewhat primitive, maybe less sophisticated than they were. They didn't speak, you know, the Greek or the Latin as their native language. You know, and so they're seeing this is what they're seeing in these people. And so Luke gives us a hint of their sophistication when he describes how they were treated. How were they treated? Yeah, they were treated pretty well. They were shown unusual kindness, which means they didn't expect themselves to be treated that way. And so what did they do? What did these people of the island do? Got these people shipwrecked. What did they do? Well, they welcomed them.
They brought the food and warmth.
They brought food. They built a fire. To keep them warm. You know, these guys are probably chilled to the bone, don't you think? After being in the water and stuck out there in the winds and everything. I do have one digression I want to embark on here on how they were treated. You know, God sets forth what he requires of church leaders. All right? Figure we're in the call process. Probably good we can take a look at this. And he says it in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. He says what? Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach another, and things like that. And in Titus, that what he's saying is here that all believers need to be able to contribute to the needs of the saints, to be able to show hospitality and things like that. There's a whole lot of other verses that are out there. Titus 1:8, Romans 12:13, Hebrews 13:2, 1 Peter 4:9. And so what this is doing is demonstrating for us a biblical truth. All right? And that biblical truth is the law is written on their hearts. All right? And even though here we've got them encountering a different culture, this innate understanding of the people is a basic understanding of what? The difference between what is right and wrong, and the difference of how people need to treat one another. Okay? It's written on their heart. And what we find here is not even a snake bite could put down the blessings of God. Okay? So this is a very interesting passage. We know the scene. Paul and the entourage are out there. They're building this fire. Paul's out collecting wood. What does that tell you? Is Paul above menial work? No, he's not. He's not above it. He's out there. You get this picture of Paul out there picking up sticks and things like that to throw on the fire. When all of a sudden disaster strikes. Nobody got the pun, huh?
Literally.
Strikes, get the strike, okay? Okay. I just wanted to make sure you guys were still awake. All right? And when we read this, what then happens? There in verse 3. This viper is driven out, fastens itself onto his hand. Now, vipers don't have anything, they don't have hands to be able to grab onto anything. So we surmise that what the snake did is the snake did what? It bit Paul, right? It just lashed out and just sunk its fangs or whatever, sunk them into Paul's hands. All right? Now, the islanders, Paul's got his hand out. I don't know whether it's left or right. I'm just doing that because I'm holding my coffee cup in my right hand. All right? So he's holding his hand out. He has got this viper hanging here from his hand. All right? Now, and so what is their thought? What is their thought?
He's going to kill him.
Well, their thought that
Oh, he's
they thought he was going to die. They were just waiting there for the show, right?
And he was a murderer and all that.
They were waiting for him to swell up and do all sorts of nasty things, but he doesn't. So then they think he's a god. Okay, distinction: little g God. Okay, little g. All right, he is a little g God. Now there are some commentators that kind of accuse Paul of trying to throw a little bit of drama in here. Okay, they accuse him of confusing poisonous snakes with non-poisonous ones. Okay, why? Because to this day there are no poisonous snakes on Malta. Okay, no poisonous snakes on Malta. But that doesn't prove that they didn't exist back in the day, does it? No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
They were very specific that it was a viper, and all vipers are poisonous.
All vipers are poisonous, right? And so we see, the reaction is, well, this guy's got to be a murderer. He was supposed to be put to death. He was supposed to die in that shipwreck. He didn't die in that shipwreck. And now he's here, and so he's got this snake on him. He's supposed to die here, but he doesn't die there. He must be a god, okay? So how many of you watched that 1,000th episode of NCIS? Nobody watched it? Am I the only one? Oh my gosh. Well, what happened was, since nobody watches it, I'll be a spoiler alert here. But what happened was they had swallowed something, and anyhow, what they were able to do was convince them that what they swallowed contained glass shards, and it was ripping their insides apart. All right? And I bring that up for a reason. I want to look up 2 verses to see why Paul's reaction was what it was. The first one I want to look at is just turn back a few pages into chapter 23, and let's look at verse 11.
But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome."
Okay, now go a little bit forward, go to Acts 27, verse 24 that we just had. What does that say?
Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who say with you.
So Paul's got this snake hanging from his hand, right? And he's resting on the promise of God that what's going to happen?
You'll make it to Rome.
He's going to go to Rome. He's going to do what God promised him he was going to be able to do. So, what do miracles do? They point us to God, okay? They point us to God. So here you've got the islanders waiting for Paul to swell up and die, and it almost comes across as though they're somewhat disappointed that he doesn't. I think they were, like I said, they were kind of all gathering for the show, and then it didn't happen. And because of that, their opinion of him changed. Now, the miracles of God opened the door for the gospel to be preached, okay, and taught with Publius, all right? So, now, see, I got a word that I got to work on here. It says, not far from where they landed was the estate of the Protestnessu, who was a leader who invited them in and entertained them for several days. And this man Publius still extended to him this hospitality, even though his father was very sick. Luke tells us what? He had a fever and dysentery, okay? Now, dysentery is often caused by poor hygiene and handling of food or milk. And so, how does God reward acts of kindness towards his people? Let's read Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3.
I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples of earth on earth will be blessed through you.
Now let's turn to Matthew 10 and look at verses 40 through 42. Matthew 10, verses 40 through 42. Somebody got it?
Whoever receives you receives me. Whoever receives me receives him who sent me. The one who receives a prophet because he is a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And the one who receives a righteous person because he is a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. Whoever gives one of those little ones even a cup of cold water because he is a disciple, truly I say to you, who by no means loses his reward.
All right, so God does show reward to those who show kindness to his people. That's the thing, that's the point I was trying to make. And so Paul went to see him, and first, what did Paul do? He prayed, okay? And then he placed his hands on him and healed him. Now, this is just another affirmation that God is working through Paul. What was the reaction of all the others? what did they do when they saw what Paul did? It's a small island, remember? Yeah, they started bringing everybody to Paul to have them heal them also. So over the course of their 3-month stay, as we find in verse 11, Paul no doubt would have seized the opportunity to in healing people, he would have preached the gospel. All right? And now I'm out of time. So we will finish this up next week. And maybe next week what I'll do is I'll start on the first of a few lessons that we'll talk about the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Just so you know what I'm going to start with, before we get into the 7 letters, I want us to get a little bit of an understanding of what the book of Revelation is all about. So as we read the letters, I think we have a better understanding of that, okay? And then we got to decide what it is we're going to study after that. Okay? And it's got to be short. Right? It's got to be short. Okay. All right, let's rise and let's close with the Lord's Prayer. So we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All righty, I'll see you guys in worship. Spend a little bit of time. There's a lot of chocolate chip cookies over there.
I have a question. You said something